participants, dear experts, thank you for taking the time today to join us for this panel discussion on the available options to repatriate or prosecute ISIS fighters and their associates in northeast Syria. Since 2019, ISIS fighters and their associates have been held in prison camps in northeast Syria by the Syrian Democratic Forces. About 70,000 women and children, relatives of ISIS fighters, have been held in Al-Hol and Al-Roj camps. Despite calls from the United States, the United Nations, and international human rights organizations around the world for countries to repatriate their citizens, very few have actually done so. This has left a situation where thousands of people are being held in abhorrent conditions without charge nor trial, with no prospects of leaving anytime soon. This leads us to the question, how do we ensure that these people are tried and prosecuted in a legal and dignified way, while also guaranteeing that they do not become threats for international peace? Today, we will explore a diversity of options regarding this issue and analyze the potential consequences this may have on individuals and institutions involved. Therefore, we are honored to welcome three distinguished experts to help us understand this complex issue. Mr. Joseph Geit, Senior Program Associate at Hidayah, Ms. Olga Ril, Director of the Pravo Public Foundation in Kazakhstan, and Dr. David Mallet, Associate Professor within the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology at the American University in Washington, D.C. Thank you all so much for being here and for partaking in this panel discussion. This panel discussion has been organized by the Bulan Institute for Peace Innovations. The Bulan Institute is a research institute based in Geneva, Switzerland, with a regional office in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Our mission is to promote peace, security, and human rights in Central Asia, Eurasia, and South Asia through research, advocacy, and dialogue. We will first listen to presentations from our experts, who will present different options with how to handle ISIS fighters and their associates in a humane fashion. We will follow their presentations with a question and answer session. The experts will be asked the questions provided by our participants. If you have a question to ask, please let us know in the Zoom chat on the right-hand side of your screen. I would like to add that our session is being live streamed to Facebook, will be recorded to share with our partners on social media, and will be posted on our website. To all participants, please keep your microphones and cameras off for the entirety of the panel discussion. Our first presentation will be from Mr. Joseph Geit. Mr. Geit is a Senior Program Associate within the Capacity Building Programs Department at Hidayah. Hidayah is an international non-governmental organization which is focused on countering violent extremism by enhancing understanding and sharing of good practices to effectively build the capacity of actors around the globe involved in countering violent extremism. Before working with Hidayah, Mr. Geit was a terrorism prevention consultant at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and has also previously worked within the office of the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator. He recently published The Blueprint of a Rehabilitation and Reintegration Center, which provides practical guidance and recommendations for governments dealing with returning foreign terrorist fighters. Mr. Geit, thank you for taking the time for being with us today. Mr. Geit, how would you characterize the current international response to the situation regarding ISIS fighters in northeast Syria? Have rehabilitation and reintegration practices worked well, and are there any best practices that you can share with us? You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Cooper, for the extremely kind introduction, and also a wider thank you to the wider Bulan Institute for arranging this meeting and for all the work that you do. It's an honor to be a speaker on this panel with such distinguished panelists. And it's my pleasure to represent Hidayah, which you kindly introduced earlier. In relation to your questions, the topic obviously of repatriation is something that is very politically complex and sensitive. And different governments are finding different ways to approach this. But one thing that has been a global consensus is the need for countries to prepare for the rehabilitation and reintegration of individuals if or when they are back in their country. And in this regard, Hidayah has been supporting countries globally on rehabilitation and reintegration since our establishment. Some of our earlier work actually relates to developing a guidance document on the role of psychologists in rehabilitation and reintegration. And this was in support of the GCTF's Rome Memorandum on the Rehabilitation and Reintegration of Violent Extremist Offenders. Some of the other work that we have been doing includes in Tunisia, where we've been comprehensively supporting the National Counterterrorism Commission in their efforts for rehabilitating, reintegrating, returning foreign terrorist fighters. And specifically, we've been working with the child detention centers, the social defense and integration centers, and the delegates for the protection of children. And this is for the preparation of the practitioners based within these centers to support the rehabilitation and social reintegration of youth and children who either are vulnerable to radicalization leading to violent extremism, who have been affected by violent extremism, or who have returned from Syria and Iraq. Other work we have been doing actually is in Indonesia as well, where we have been working with social workers and psychologists in rehabilitation centers throughout the country on how to support families in CVE. And that's specifically as well on families who are returning from Syria and Iraq as a whole family unit, and keeping perhaps some family members together with the youth and the primary caregivers with the children, and to provide rehabilitation and reintegration support for these individuals as well. Additionally, and not quite related to Syria and Iraq, but is very related topic, is our work that's been ongoing in Nigeria, and particularly in Northeast Nigeria, where we've worked with community-based organizations and community leaders. And that's on preparing these with individuals and organizations with the skills and knowledge to rehabilitate and reintegrate returning former Boko Haram members back into their community, and especially those who have voluntarily returned back to their community without necessarily going through formal rehabilitation channels, such as the government's Operation Safe Corridor. And this has been a challenge, particularly in Nigeria, and could be a challenge that we see growing in other countries where individuals make their own return. And another program I would like to highlight is our EU Global Strive program. And I highlight this because we've worked with a number of local organizations in the development of research that is nationally contextualized to support their local governments on the rehabilitation and reintegration efforts. For example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have supported research on the social, economic, and security factors related to returning foreign terrorist fighters. In North Macedonia, we have supported Nexus social civil concept on the research related to the motives that led to foreign terrorist fighters joining the conflict. And Nexus actually conducted interviews with foreign terrorist fighters currently in prisons and their family members as well. And this gives unique insights. And similarly, we're currently finalizing another research project at the moment in Kyrgyzstan, which is related to why individuals traveled as foreign terrorist fighters, but also importantly, why they actually returned as well. And to do this, we have supported the interview of 38 returned foreign terrorist fighters in the prisons of Kyrgyzstan, as well as their family members. But the main initiative that I would like to talk about today, and as you kindly introduced earlier, Cooper, is Hidayah's recent publication, A Blueprint for a Rehabilitation and Reintegration Center. And the reason why I would like to highlight this is because it's quite comprehensive on rehabilitation and reintegration, but also highlights a lot of the options that you were talking about. It doesn't provide a singular pathway which a government should take for rehabilitation and reintegration, but rather it provides a series of decisions that need to be made by these governments in order to have an effective program. So to develop this document, we actually collected inputs from many expert practitioners around the world through comprehensive surveys, one-to-one interviews, and a series of workshops. And we compared all of this information we got with the current existing literature in order to develop a very practical guide, which contains about 140 guiding principles. It's, as I mentioned, it's designed not to provide a singular pathway, but options. And in that regard, every guiding principle that we have has a number of considerations underneath it, so that each government can tailor this to their own priorities and their own needs. So, for example, if we provide a guiding principle, maybe a country doesn't necessarily have the resources that are required to actually implement that guiding principle. And I think we all know that that's quite a problem for many countries with the international good practices. They don't have the resources to actually implement this. So we provide considerations on how they can still achieve those intended outcomes while using minimal resources and an adapted approach. And similarly, we also take into consideration if the country decides to go through the pathway of using the prison system, or whether they choose to establish a singular rehabilitation and reintegration center, and how that decision impacts the various guiding principles as well, and the different considerations that need to be taken in that regard. So it's a very practical document. It contains a number of case studies which are very useful to share the successes of other countries, but it also contains example checklists as well. So it provides a list of example standard operating procedures that would need to be developed. It gives examples of the types of qualifications that each staff member should have in order to effectively engage in these programs. It also provides relevant tools and also a list of various interventions, both for rehabilitation and for reintegration. Obviously, and I kind of emphasized this already, that this needs to be very contextualized to the national situation. This is not a silver bullet. It's not going to necessarily help everyone in the same way. But what it does is, if it's contextualized to the national priorities and needs, it can provide a framework that will allow for the development of an effective rehabilitation and reintegration center or program. What I just want to do now is just to go through some of the chapters in that document and highlight those options that we were talking about, those decisions that kind of need to be made by the governments. So, for example, in the first chapter, we talk about the international and national legal frameworks and policies. And here, one of the key options that needs to be decided very early on by a government is whether they want to start establishing a whole new framework for this, or whether they want to build upon existing frameworks and policies and legislation related to the correctional system, or even the social welfare institutions and system. And a good example of this is actually Indonesia, that I mentioned before. Their Handayani Center was originally developed to support youth and children in need of social rehabilitation in relation to drugs, trafficking, and violence. But in 2016, they were given the additional mandate to work with youth and family members who were affected by violent extremism. And this was quite an effective approach because it enabled the government to respond quite quickly, but also to minimize the resources required. This was already an established center. It just needed further capacity building on specific topics. The second chapter then looks at governance and oversight. And obviously we look at the roles, the responsibilities, the leadership, the budgets. But one of the key things that we need to look at here as well is, if you're going through the prison system to rehabilitate and reintegrate your returning foreign terrorist fighters, the options are: do you segregate these violent extremist offenders from the general prison population, as is the case in the Netherlands? Or do you integrate and separate these offenders, as is the case in Canada, for example? And what are the relevant considerations that need to be taken on board, depending on the pathway that you choose? We also then look at, if you're establishing a rehabilitation center, what are the physical structure and resource requirements? What are the options there? And there are some that may not be considered off the bat. For example, where do you actually locate this center? Do you locate it near the host community to support the reintegration process, but perhaps there's a threat there because of the radicalization that was occurring in the community? Or do you have it near government facilities and institutions to support processes and transporting, for example? And what are the options for spaces? Do you include the recreational, the counseling spaces? And how do these spaces need to be contextualized to your given culture as well? So there's many different factors that need to be considered just within the center itself before we even start populating it. And then we start looking at the human resources. And obviously there are many different human resource options in relation to whether you go through the prison system or you go through the social welfare system, and what are the qualifications of these staff. But one of the other questions and the options that's often raised is actually who should be involved and what capacity building should be provided. And this often relates to the fact that governments will often select their government officials and their central bodies and their staff just provide the rehabilitation reintegration support. And that's a very important role. But it's often overlooked that there are local actors and CSOs that also need to be involved. And so at the very start, governments need to be doing a comprehensive and holistic analysis of what human resources are available, not just governmental, but non-governmental as well, and based in communities. And this will allow them then to really select what are the best options available for their context. And an example to highlight a lesson learned here was actually from Pakistan. In Pakistan, they had a number of expert psychologists who they then trained to support the rehabilitation process in prisons. But after the training, many of these psychologists actually didn't want to travel to the rural areas or to join the prisons and wanted to remain in the capital. And this left a gap that had to then be filled by those local CSOs. So it's really important that that assessment and that analysis is conducted early on to identify who are the appropriate actors to provide the support to these individuals at every level as well. We then also look at assessing the client, and that's client classification, threats assessment, risk assessment, and needs assessment. And we do provide a number of example tools that are out there. There are a number of international tools that a government may choose to utilize, or they may choose to adapt to their context. But they could even choose to develop their own nationally contextualized assessment tools. But this is quite a time-consuming process, especially to prove its effectiveness. So we provide options on the types of tools that could be used, but we do provide a lot of emphasis on the use of needs assessments. And that's because in conjunction with those risk assessments, needs assessments really allow us to identify what were those factors that actually led the individual to vulnerability and eventual radicalization leading to violent extremism. And therefore, what are the most effective responses that we can implement for that individual? A really tailored approach. And that kind of brings me on to the next point of rehabilitation interventions. As I mentioned, we do provide a list of different types of these interventions, and that includes counseling, religious counseling, motivational interviewing, education, vocational training, sports, culture, arts, social activities. All of these are options that need to be considered as to whether they are relevant for the national context and also for the individual. So it may be recommended for the Rehabilitation Centre or programme to develop a comprehensive set of possible interventions and a manual for these interventions, really manualising them, and then being able to pick and choose the interventions and tailoring them to the individual as well. The final chapter then looks at the reintegration. And there's obviously a number of options related to the individual when we're talking about reintegration. But one thing that I would like to highlight is actually the community and the real importance that we need to focus our energy on working with the community, not just when we start in the reintegration, but throughout the whole process. The community really hold a lot of power over the success of our rehabilitation and reintegration programs. If the community rejects or stigmatizes the reintegrating individual, then there's the likelihood that they might seek out their former group where they were accepted, and we run the risk of recidivism. So we really need to make sure that we are involved in the communities from the beginning, and that's community representatives, actors, and CSOs, so that they have a full understanding of the processes which this individual has undergone, what is involved in the rehabilitation, but also, very importantly, so that we can identify under which conditions the community are willing to accept that individual to come back. As I mentioned, they hold a lot of power, so we need to be making sure that we are working in partnership with the communities and that they are in agreement to receive these reintegrating individuals. I know I've covered a lot of ground there very quickly and many topics. So I would like to encourage all of the participants and the observers to please check out our blueprint document. It is free on Hidaya's website, and it will soon be available also in Arabic, in French, and Albanian as well. But thank you very much for your time, and I would now like to hand back to Cooper. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guy. That was a really fascinating overview of the work your NGO is performing around the world. And yes, it's very important to share these experiences, to share guidelines, to manualize options, as you said. It's very interesting, and hopefully it will give a lot of good ideas to our participants. Our second presentation will be from Dr. David Mallet, Associate Professor within the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology at the American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Mallet has a long and distinguished academic career researching and teaching about international security, transnational militancy, U.S. national security, and foreign policy. He has a PhD from George Washington University and has extensive policy experience, having served in 2 U.S. administrations. He has written 3 books and recently published an essay in the Terrorism and Political Violence Journal entitled Foreign Fighters, Returnees, an Indefinite Threat. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, Dr. Mallet. We appreciate it. Dr. Mallet, given your academic background in this field, we would like to know your thoughts on how to deal with this situation and how we avoid them becoming a further threat to international peace. Do you think that repatriation and rehabilitation will help to combat terrorism in the long run? Do you have any historical examples of how the absence of demobilization and disarmament contributed to the overall rise of violent extremism? And why would it be important? Why is it so important for international peace to find a viable solution to this situation? Thank you very much, Dr. Mallet. You have the floor.
Thank you, Cooper. I will do my best to answer those questions and hopefully some others as well. First, I would like to thank Bulan Institute. I'd like to thank Chopin for inviting me to participate and to follow along from her point and those that Joe made as well. There are a variety of different programs in different countries that are currently being enacted to deal with returnees from Syria and Iraq. In some cases, there's quite a big difference in the political responses between different countries. One of the big debates right now is simply whether to admit or to facilitate the return of country citizens at all. And so I'd like to talk about the policy decisions related to those in context. They are, of course, political decisions, and they're often driven very reasonably by fears of domestic terrorism. What do returnees do after they return? To try to answer these security questions, both in terms of whether returnees should be brought home, should be allowed to return home, also the types of programs that might be effective in working with them and rehabilitating and integrating them. I would like to take a look at some of the historical context. I think it matters to look at questions of what we can expect from returnees. And the good news, I suppose, is that we actually have quite a bit of data on this. There are foreign fighters in a number, and civilian supporters as well, in a number of cases going back decades, even centuries. So we actually have hundreds of thousands of potential data points to compare. So today I would like to look at the context of a couple of major instances of foreign fighters and how they were handled by different countries and by different international bodies at the time in response to them throughout history. Again, we have the context now of what is perhaps unique with the fact that the majority of individuals who have not been repatriated are minors, are women and children who are civilian supporters of ISIS. That is something that is different, but we do have some instances that might be useful as guidelines as well. So I'm going to try to share screen. And I think I need a screen sharing permission before I can do that. But I can start talking. Hopefully, if it's possible to show PowerPoint, we'll do so.
Yes, David, there should be a share screen button at the bottom, the green button at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully
Yes.
that will help you.
It's telling me the host is disabled participant screen sharing. So.
All right, well then I will allow you to do that.
Appreciate that.
In a moment, but yes, go ahead, and then I'll allow you to.
Right. So as Cooper mentioned, I've actually been working on the issue of foreign fighters in a historical context for quite some time. That was my doctoral dissertation that I began in 2005. So I've been considering this question prior to the establishment of the ISIS caliphate and the civilians who traveled and fighters who traveled to join it. And what I would say is that we actually have, thank you, I'm going to share my screen. We actually have quite a long record of individuals traveling to be foreign fighters. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. This is my doctoral dissertation, which is a book at this point. The cover is actually a propaganda poster from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. It was poking fun at the side that was the so-called nationalists and how they relied on so much external support, both for fighters and for financing. So, you know, the question of is the Spanish Civil War comparable to what we see now? I would argue it is. There's a lot of similarities with foreign fighters across different contexts. And again, this gives us some indication of what we might expect from their behavior, both from jihadis over the past 40 years and from others over the past century. So when it comes to policy options, I think it's important to consider three main factors. One is, what have we seen in the past? What has been done in the past by different countries and international organizations and NGOs? What do returnees actually do? I think this question should actually guide decisions made about which interventions would be most appropriate for them. So we'll take a look at what we've seen, at least from jihadis over the past few decades. If a returnee is going to become a security threat, you know, what is the time frame for this? What types of actions do they engage in? And also we'll take a look at what the options that are most likely to be enacted are, given the policy context and legal context that we have at this time. So the big debate about returnees, I think the security dimension, is this concern that ISIS, perhaps there would be people in camps who should not be repatriated because they would be security threats, that they had perhaps been trained to engage in attacks when they return. At the same time, there's a recognition that keeping tens of thousands of individuals in camps, not only, especially as far as minors go, is a long-term potential security threat for radicalization, but also that you can have operations conducted within camps. And there have been, as recently as yesterday or the day before, I believe, there have been a series of arrests related to crime, that these are not safe places. They're also places where illicit organizations can flourish. So even with countries that are perhaps reluctant to allow their citizens to return home, or have even stripped their citizenship from them to prevent them from returning home, there is this continuing sense of a security threat that needs to be addressed. As I mentioned, I've looked at foreign fighters over the past 2 centuries, really, and I'm going to present data in that context. This is a graph showing the number of civil wars, which is the red or orange line in the back, and the number of them that have had foreign fighters in them, which is the blue line in the front. And you can see in recent, it only goes through the middle of the past decade, but you can see that the number of foreign fighters has been increasing, both in absolute numbers and also as a proportion of the number of rebel groups or insurgencies have had more transnational support, more than have relied upon transnational support. So we actually have quite a number of past cases that we can look at. And I'd like to talk about a couple of them right now. Believe it or not, there have actually, over the past century, been far more foreign fighters for Marxist causes, for Marx than for Muhammad, I suppose you would say. And in fact, there have been at least as many foreign fighters for 3 different communist causes as there have been in ISIS as well, tens of thousands, 40, 50,000 or more in the Russian Civil War and Revolution in the 1910s, 1920s, the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and also the Chinese Civil War in the 1930s and 40s. It's important to note that these are comparable in the sense that they had, large numbers of individuals, tens of thousands. They had transnational support through organizations like the Communist International. And the foreign fighters also received some degrees of state support, whether through the Soviet Union, China at the time, as well the People's Republic of China. In the Russian case, the initial one, you were looking at people who were perhaps not as comparable initially. There were large numbers of World War I prisoners from the Habsburg Empire. They were Czech, they were Latvian. You also had a large number of people from China and Korea who were either come as communists or had come were already in Russia as laborers. And what we saw in all of these cases was a large number of cases of violence against civilians. You had some of these foreign volunteers or recruits used as death squads by the Bolsheviks. This is a propaganda poster depicting Chinese death squads being used as an attempt to stir up public opposition to the Bolsheviks. In most cases, there was no international response to this, even though you had, the estimates vary greatly, 50,000, perhaps 150,000 foreign volunteers. There was no international attempts to reintegrate them. So the Soviet Union kept some. There were others who they believed in Moscow to be useful, that were sent back and actually became leaders later of countries like Hungary, Yugoslavia, Albania. Those were, in fact, agents who had been foreign fighters. In other cases, they simply returned with no consequences whatsoever. And it's important to note, most foreign fighters historically have simply reintegrated without assistance programs. You have in some cases, handfuls of individuals, tens of individuals who become involved in militant causes at home or have become foreign fighters in other conflicts subsequently. But it's important to note that typically just some form of amnesty has been sufficient to prevent radicalization or violence that's been noticeable, that's left a historical record in most cases. An example of that would be the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. This is a photo of members of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, which were the Canadian volunteers in the international brigades, communist international brigades. In this case, in 1939, the League of Nations actually organized an international returnee program where foreign fighters were sent back to their home countries. Again, the transportation and costs were organized by the League of Nations in Geneva. And in fact, the returnees were actually given pocket money so that they would not become a public burden, would be able to reintegrate. And in this case, the program appeared to be successful. We have very few instances of individuals who even became participants in subsequent conflicts. In a lot of the Western countries where they did return, they were kept under watch for a number of years as potential communist agents. In the United States, during World War II, the Second World War, the foreign fighters were the only Americans who had any combat experience, yet they were not allowed to have combat roles in the military because they were politically suspect. But again, we don't see instances of individuals becoming national security threats in these cases. So why did these tens of thousands of individuals reintegrate? Why was that different with the jihadis? I would argue is entirely due to the national policy responses. That the foreign fighters who went to Afghanistan were different, and the jihadi movement that grew from them has been different than some of these past cases like the communists, but also like ethnic conflicts as well, because they were not permitted to return home. They were criminalized. They knew that they would be tortured or executed, at the very least returned to prison upon returning to some of the Arab states that released them to go fight in Afghanistan. And so they left. They didn't return home. They stayed involved in insurgencies elsewhere. They became involved in global terrorist networks. And I argue that this persistence is the mainly due to the fact that there were no returnee programs, but primarily no amnesty arranged for them. It's been said by others, not by me, that there have been 4 waves of jihadis over the past 4 decades, 5 decades coming up, that we had the initial volunteers in Afghanistan in the 1980s and early 1990s, those who became Al-Qaeda. Very few of them were hardened fighters. Many of them were students who went on spring break for a week to pose with guns and simply went home. But there were a few who stayed. There were perhaps a couple hundred who stayed that became the seeds of Al-Qaeda and who dispersed to conflicts like Algeria, Chechnya, the Philippines, and elsewhere. During the 1990s, most of the individuals who became transnational jihadis went for training so that they could bring those skills back to their home countries, to their own organizations. You didn't see an immediate security threat because they were preparing for conflicts, either for terrorist operations in the West or because they went abroad to other conflicts that bleed out from Afghanistan, as it was described. After the September 11th attacks, there was a big concern as the number of foreign fighters increased in places like Iraq in the 2000s, Afghanistan, Somalia. But a lot of those cases, these were people who were volunteering for suicide attacks or martyrdom operations. So the threat of returnees was not as great as initially anticipated. We haven't seen those who went to ISIS, the records indicate that they did not sign up for suicide attacks. They wanted to be fighters into ISIS with the expectation of making a life in the caliphate there. And so their behavior is not going to be the same as those who joined in the 2000s. There were a lot of predictions, as I'll discuss in a minute, that many of them would become domestic terrorists if they were permitted to return. We haven't seen that yet. We've seen that in some limited cases, as is historically consistent, but not in large numbers. But again, we have this new issue of large numbers of civilian detainees. What to do with them, what is effective? Well, we don't have to go back to the 1930s and the Spanish Civil War to look at international programs for dealing with large numbers of combatants who have demobilized and have at least the aspirations to return to a number of different countries. The terms foreign fighter or foreign terrorist fighter are used interchangeably. Sometimes different terms are used for different programs. In the 2000s, and there's a smaller follow-up program in the 2010s, you had foreign fighters, or as they were called by the organizations dealing with them, combatants on foreign soil, or COFs, around the African Great Lakes. And there were programs designed to, DDR programs, designed to help immobilize them, to send them home, to give them some sort of economic assistance, to set up farms or jobs training. And although it's actually very difficult to get real data on a country level about the successes of these programs, at the time, the World Bank reported great success in demobilizing and reintegrating large numbers of foreign fighters. You could argue that some of the programs that have been attempted in countries like Denmark have been DDR model programs, just in a non-Civil War context. What I think is interesting is that the judgment has been that foreign fighters, or COFs, if you want to call them that, the United Nations, the World Bank, and others who are involved said they should never be allowed to just be left to their own devices. They should always receive some sort of assistance to go home. But it's easier to say that when they're not returning to the donor countries, right? We get very different debates, I think, in Europe and in North America about that. What we know from the historical context is that foreign fighters typically don't have a very good experience of it. They're used as cannon fodder, essentially, by local commanders. The ones that survive report that they have, in every case I've been able to observe throughout the last couple of hundred years, they end up in conflicts with the local fighters and civilian population who they're ostensibly there to defend and protect. I can't find evidence. I don't think anyone was looking for evidence of PTSD. I can't find any older names for it in the historical context, but given the conditions, I think you would find that foreign fighters historically have the same high levels of PTSD that we see with returnees to Europe, to Southeast Asia, from Syria. We find that very few of them remain, even when they win the wars, they don't stay. And some of them remain loyal for decades to their organization, but many of them come back and say, this is not what I thought it was at all. I was used badly. I was lied to about the necessity of fighting. The ones who do remain loyal, we see, are effective recruiters. They actually become the basis of the recruitment networks for subsequent volunteers because they have the connections, because they have the credibility in their communities. So the biggest role that we've seen with returnees from a security standpoint, working with militant groups, is that they become facilitators and recruiters rather than becoming domestic terrorists. Due to some of the studies that were published in the early years of the ISIS period, there was a concern that you would have large numbers of returnees become domestic terrorists, perhaps as many as 10%. But this is not what we see consistently throughout history. We see smaller numbers, and that's what we've seen with ISIS as well. Handfuls of individuals, not large percentages. As I mentioned, here are some of the volunteers who went to Spain. Some of them remained loyal for decades, though. So there is this concern about affiliations remaining for a long time, right? And so this leads to the question of how long might somebody be a potential security threat if your concern is returnees and domestic terrorism. So I've had the opportunity to be in a couple of participate in a couple of studies. Cooper mentioned one of them. I'd like to share data very briefly from these that tell us something about how returnees behave with jihadis. It's a little bit more difficult to get the data from the past cases. One of them I had the opportunity to study with Rachel Hayes, that was published a couple of years ago, was looking at the lag time. If somebody is going to conduct or attempt to conduct a domestic terror attack after returning as a foreign fighter, typically how long does it take them? How long do we have to worry about them? The chart on the top starts, it's 1980 through 2016. And you can see that the dots are attacks or attempted attacks. And you can see that they cluster at the bottom, that a handful of months. There are very few of them beyond, let's say, the 2-year mark, let's say. And the number looks pretty consistent horizontally across time from 1980 up till 2016. We don't see changes, let's say, from the Arab Afghan volunteers in the 1980s through ISIS fighters in the 2010s. The chart at the bottom shows you how many years, right? And you see the vast majority of them, it's less than 1 year. It's typically 4 to 5 months. So what we see from looking at 230 cases of jihadis who returned to Western countries, I should point that out, that was where we were able to get the evidence, is that the vast majority of them who attempt to become domestic terrorists do so within 4 to 5 months, hardly any beyond a year or two. We see no evidence of sleeper cells, of people returning and waiting to be terrorists later. We find that prison doesn't have an effect because most of the ones who attempt to engage in an attack haven't had time to go to prison because they do something right away. And we don't see any evidence of plots being deferred because somebody has gone to prison for years. As I mentioned, the numbers have remained consistent throughout decades. So what I feel comfortable saying is that we have this, we'll call it a dark window. Paramedics talk about a golden hour to save people. It looks like we have this period where people are most at risk of 4 to 5 months, and then the threat curve falls sharply after that. So any disengagement, rehabilitation programs, but also surveillance from a security perspective should really be targeted within the first 6 months to 1 year. And that's critically important. If you don't have interventions, people are more likely to be security threats without them. I also was part of another study with a couple of colleagues looking at the converse question of what happens if you don't permit people to return or if they're allowed to go elsewhere without effective interventions. We found a number of individuals who have been jihadis who've joined multiple groups, sometimes as many as 6 different groups in 5 or 6 different countries. And we find that they actually, the ones who survive, I mentioned they're used as cannon fodder historically, but the ones who survive tend to rise in the ranks. They gain experience and they become people who are local commanders of insurgent groups, people who are involved in international terror plots. They use the esteem that they've earned transnationally, as it turns out, because they move from one group to another and they actually become disseminators of information, of best practices. They will even write manuals for other groups to use. We see that perhaps a quarter of them were already domestic militants or terrorists before they left. They already had skills. So this idea that we only have to worry about security from returnees is not quite correct. We see people who are already involved diffusing out to places like Syria and becoming security threats there. And we do see about a third of them becoming involved in militant activity after they return. But they are actually mostly different individuals than those who were involved as domestic militants and terrorists before they left. So some people clearly do radicalize while they're away. And again, this chart shows, it tries to show sort of 3 ranks of executive, mid-level, and operational foot soldiers in insurgencies. And we see that about half of them, foreign fighters who join multiple groups, rise in the ranks to mid-level. A few even become leaders in countries where they are not from, countries that have perhaps never even been before, but because of their experience as jihadis, they rise in the ranks. So to me, Osama bin Laden, I often say anecdotally, if you don't repatriate, Exhibit A of what happens is Osama bin Laden. That's an anecdote, but there does appear to be some data backing that up, that there's a greater threat from not repatriating that in terms of both local insurgencies and global terrorist threats than there is of bringing people back. I'm not going to say very much, both in the interest of time, because I think most of the audience is familiar with it, of the international laws that were passed in response to ISIS volunteers, but we have a couple of UN Security Council resolutions that require every country to prevent their citizens from traveling, but also, very importantly, requires every country to repatriate their citizens and deal with them through their own legal systems. Now, some countries try to find, including the United States, have tried to find reasons for not bringing their citizens back, even when they encourage other countries to do so. They'll make arguments that this person is not necessarily a citizen because of the diplomatic status of their parents. And we find enforcement varies, not just reintegration programs, but prosecutions can vary widely. And this is actually one argument made by some countries for stripping citizenship. They say it's impossible to prosecute people for crimes in Syria, the evidentiary standards prevent that. This raises some other issues as well. Concerns about Homeland Security. If you strip someone's citizenship so they can't return home, you're effectively creating a security threat for other countries, which violates the international principle of non-refoulement, that countries can't dump their security problems on other countries. I will just point out in closing that there have been some instances of successful prosecutions using evidence, and going back years at this point already, evidence obtained in Syria. Some countries, like Indonesia, have changed their laws to come into compliance with the UN Security Council resolutions to allow prosecution based on evidence collected in Iraq and Syria. So that concern shouldn't necessarily prevent countries from prosecuting from bringing their citizens back. But the biggest issue, of course, I think, is a political one. It's simply that some countries are more concerned about a local domestic security threat, a homeland security threat, and so they are choosing to allow their citizens to remain in detention camps. When, as the other participants are talking about today, there have been a number of successful reintegration programs. There have also historically, as I hope I've illustrated, a number of successful reintegration programs that give us alternative options. So with that, I will end there. And again, I thank Bulan Institute for giving me the opportunity to share this presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mallet. That was really fascinating. Thank you for putting this into a historical context. I mean, it's people often don't consider this issue from that perspective. And so this is really important. And as you mentioned, yes, there have been recent success stories, and we will explore one of them now. Our final presentation is from Ms. Olga, the director of the Pravo Public Foundation and the head of the Chance Center for Legal, Social, and Psychological Assistance in Kazakhstan. Ms. Real has been directly working with repatriated women and children in Kazakhstan. The Kazakh government selected her organization to be involved in the Operation Jusan, the operation that repatriated the majority of Kazakh citizens in northeast Syria. This organization was selected because of their history of rehabilitation centers to work with teenagers and youth, and extensive experience working with trauma and radicalization cases. We asked Ms. Real to share the experience of Kazakhstan to rehabilitate and reintegrate women and children. Thank you, Ms. Real, for being with us today. Now, we pre-recorded Ms. Real's presentation. The presentation will be in Russian with English subtitles. She will, however, be available for the question and answer session with Chopin translating her answers for us. So if you could just give me a moment to play the video.
Была 6 января в Актау, но до того, как в 2019 году, но уже где-то примерно с сентября
Cooper, there is no sound.
Была 6 января в Актау, но до того, как в 2019 году, но уже где-то примерно с сентября, даже, может быть, чуть раньше, где-то май, в это время уже началась подготовка по функционированию адаптационного центра, куда мы могли бы поместить для прохождения медицинского обследования, для прохождения карантинных мероприятий по категории лиц, которые будут возвращены в Казахстан. Значит, был составлен план, была составлена программа, было выделено финансирование в этой части. Значит, было проведено ряд заседаний, начиная с заседания администрации президента, заканчивая заседаниями в Акимате, организационными, по решению организационных мероприятий в Акимате Мангистауской области. Были назначены ответственные лица, начиная с системы здравоохранения, образования, юстиции, Министерства внутренних дел, ну, соответственно, Комитета национальной безопасности, потому что они осуществляли ввоз этих детей. И был составлен прямо пошаговый план работы момента возвращения. Но так как возникли определенные моменты, только в начале января первая партия, Шусана-1 мы их называем, они поступили. Это было 11 женщин, 30 детей, одна женщина в лагерь адаптационный, это не лагерь, это центр адаптационный, не попала, потому что она была сразу арестована и сразу же помещена в следственный изолятор. То есть вопросы, связанные со следствием и так далее, нас не касались. Наша задача стояла в организации вопросов, связанных с медицинским обследованием, организации программ ПМПК, то есть установление уровня педагогического уровня подготовленности детей, которые вернулись. Затем с ними в это же время начали работать теологи, религоведы, был привлечен также комитет по делам религии, такая же неправительственная организация, которая у нас работает с деструктивными религиозными течениями и которая работает с осужденными в местах лишения свободы, как нет. Были привлечены психологи из университета, я уже сказала, практикующие психологи и практикующие теологи. Значит, когда поступила вот первая партия женщин и детей, первое, что было сделано сразу изначально, первый этап, это они сразу же начали проходить медицинское обследование. Был организован целый мобильный передвижной медицинский блок. Я вам хочу сказать, что на 38 инфекций только брали сразу же анализ на те инфекции, которые относятся к категории особо опасные. Сразу же смотрели все специалисты, начиная от педиатров, терапевтов и заканчивая узким профилем, если возникала такая необходимость. Если возникала необходимость, то маму или ребенка помещали в стационар для того, чтобы оказать более первичную помощь медицинскую. Это особенно касалось женщин и детей, вернувшихся в рамках Жусан-2, потому что там были раненые, там были люди, которые, и дети, и женщины, которым были ампутированы, в частности, нога, и которым необходимо было специализированное лечение в рамках медицинского учреждения. И затем, когда они получали первичную помощь, они перемещались уже в адаптационный центр. В основном, в общей сложности, каждая группа, она находилась порядка 30 дней. То есть, если сразу же в течение полудня делался забор полностью всех анализов, полностью осмотр шел, заводилась сразу же медицинская карта на ребенка. Вторым этапом в течение этого же дня, прямо вот женщина прошла с ребенком обследование, и ее сразу же переводили в душевую, где она купалась сама, купались дети, вещи сразу же забирались, потому что, ну, представьте себе, женщины не имели возможности поменять эту одежду. Сразу же выдавалась чистая новая одежда, как для мам, так и для детей. Учитывался характер религиозной принадлежности женщин, но единственным условием было, что они могли, они не одевали хиджабы с закрытыми лицами и так далее. Ну, носили, сразу же были данные платки, специальные шапочки, для того, чтобы женщины уже полностью оделись так, как им положено. Были проблемы с детьми, которые, да, привыкли за все время тоже находиться покрытыми, но мы разрешили этот вопрос, то есть девочкам дали панамки, мальчишкам кепки, и как вот эти моменты были сразу же решены. Сразу же после того, как первый день прошел, второй день это был день отдыха, на третий день у нас сразу же заработала группа детского сада и группа школы. То есть у нас были приглашены преподаватели начальных классов, приглашены воспитатели из организации образования города Актау, которые которые стали работать с этими детьми, начиная сразу же с завтрака, то есть дети завтракали вместе с мамами, и потом каждый ребенок шел по направлению. Либо он шел в детский сад, либо он шел в школу, где проводились занятия, и после обеда делалось домашнее задание. Первое время это делали педагоги, потому что нужно было выяснить уровень подготовки детей. Затем мы стали привлекать мам для того, чтобы сформировать детско-родительские отношения уже несколько другого плана, потому что ответственности за то, чтобы ребенок занимался, учился, выполнял уроки. Для некоторых мам это было непонятно, потому что они этого не делали. И изначально это было у них утеряно. Вот этот момент формирования детско-родительских отношений, он был очень важен для того, чтобы установить доброжелательные отношения, увидеть, насколько может быть активна мама, может быть, ей дополнительно там необходимо какие-то проведения каких-то семинаров, тренингов. Сразу же был проведен юридический семинар, тренинг для женщин, связанный с информированием их о административной и уголовной ответственности за ненадлежащее выполнение родительских функций, ненадлежащее исполнение своих обязанностей. Я хочу сказать, что это было очень важно, потому что для женщин это было непонятно, что. На второй день у нас прибыли представители комитета миграционной службы Министерства внутренних дел. Женщины были сразу же сфотографированы, сразу же была получена информация по их документированию. И буквально в течение 10 дней уже прибыли свидетельства о рождении, удостоверения личности женщин из Астаны были переданы. И были восстановлена информация по детям, которые были рождены в Казахстане. То есть мы получили формы из РАКСов о том, когда, где был выдано свидетельство о рождении ребенка. Это было в большом восторге, потому что сразу же там в Актау начали работать наши юристы, опрашивая женщин, когда и где родились другие дети, кто был свидетелем этого рождения, обучались ли дети где-то там, ходили ли они в какие-то школы при мечети, или родители сами обучали детей. Вот весь этот период, он был посвящен такой вот медико-социальной реабилитации, теологической реабилитации женщин в течение месяца. Когда завершился месяц их пребывания, они были перемещены в наши центры, в Центры социально-психологической правовой поддержки несовершеннолетних «Шанс». У нас при этих центрах есть гостиницы, детские гостиницы, где мамы с детьми могут проживать определенное время для того, чтобы решить свои проблемы жилищные, бытовые, трудовые или профессионального обучения. Самый большой срок проживания у нас был год. Это было связано, это в Алмате, это было связано с тем, что пандемия, то есть женщина с дочерью несовершеннолетней и ее ребенком, она была помещена к нам в центр, но они восстановились, начали работать, мы им дали возможность, проживая, начать работать, они стали снимать себе квартиру, им помогали родственники, но, к сожалению, когда начался карантин, пандемия, они не смогли дальше работать, потому что учреждения были закрыты, и они вернулись к нам, и вот только в декабре месяце прошлого года они у нас вышли опять в самостоятельное плавание, то есть стали проживать самостоятельно. Вторая семья, достаточно долго проживавшая у нас, это семья, женщина, которая имела 4 детей, она была сиротой. Она проживала порядка 6 месяцев в городе Жезказган, Карагандинской области. Сейчас изыскала возможности ТИМАТ, так как она в прошлом была сиротой, значит, ей приобрели двухкомнатную квартиру, и она сейчас там проживает вместе со своими детьми. мы разделили эту группу детей по тем школам, куда они конкретно пойдут, каждый в какую школу. И было дополнительно проведены экскурсии уже конкретно с преподавателем, с классным руководителем, с классом, в какой класс она зайдет, где она будет сидеть, ребенок, куда он будет ходить кушать, где он может попить, сходить, вплоть до того, где расположены туалеты. То есть этих детей мы знакомились заранее с работой школы. В отношении детей, которые не шли в школу по возрастным категориям, значит, решались вопросы, связанные с тем, чтобы разместить их в детские сады, там, где это не предоставлялось возможным, в центре подготовки детей. Значит, желательно, конечно, это было на бесплатной основе, потому что мамы не были материально готовы к содержанию и оплате своих расходов. Значит, в это время же параллельно шло обучение мам, то есть они шли на курсы. Мы выделили ряд, разделили по категориям образования, то есть те женщины, которые закончили высшее образование, женщины, бросившие высшие вузы, обучение в высших вузах, женщины, завершившие образование после среднего специального образования, женщины, которые не имели образования только 9 классов, и в соответствии с этим, значит, для них были организованы как платные, мы оплачивали платные курсы для них, так и они ходили на бесплатные курсы, которые были организованы управлением труда и занятости и социальных программ. Курсы длились, самые длительные курсы у нас были от 6 месяцев. Это курсы, связанные для 2 специалистов, для 2 женщин, которые имели высшее техническое образование, связанное с программированием. То есть мы их восстановили в их специальности. Они в соответствии с прошлым закончили. Это достаточно серьезные вузы в Казахстане, казахстанско-британские, казахстанско-американские университеты. Значит, мы их подготовили, они восстановили свои трудовые навыки и сейчас работают. Значит, одна девочка у нас поступила в высшее учебное заведение. Значит, 2 девочки поступили в колледж по профилю тому, какой они хотели. К сожалению, девушка, которая поступила в медицинский колледж, она через 8 месяцев вышла замуж, к сожалению, 2-й женой и уехала в другой регион. Но, тем не менее, работа с ней продолжается, потому что все равно основная цель – это сформировать у них потребность понимания того, что им необходимо работать, зарабатывать, содержать своих детей. Параллельно с этим шло оформление адреса социальной помощи. Значит, у нас в Казахстане была принята новая концепция оказания специальных социальных услуг, социальной помощи. Значит, и женщины, имеющие 4-5 детей, для них оформлялась АСП. Это адресная социальная помощь, достаточно серьезные финансовые средства. Особенно в регионах, там на юге, это были достаточно хорошие деньги, на которые женщина могла содержать своего ребенка. Единственной проблемой, конечно, оставалась и остается на сегодняшний день, это проблема решения жилья. Почему? Потому что женщины выезжали со своими мужьями, и, к сожалению, то имущество, которое у них было, они продавали, а финансовые средства были истрачены на определенные цели, к тому же в Сирии. Даже женщины сами не могут объяснить, куда достаточно серьезные суммы от бизнеса были израсходованы их мужьями. Вот как бы так. Значит, после прохождения курсов, значит, девочки самостоятельно начинали работать, например, массажистками работает. Девочка у нас закончила специальные медицинские курсы, касающиеся косметологии. То есть по возможности. Ну, конечно, большая часть женщин, она стала работать вместе со своими родственниками на рынках. Почему? В торговых точках, в бутиках, потому что это быстрые деньги. Это быстрые каждодневные деньги, которые дают им возможность быть материально независимыми от родственниками.
So that was our presentation from Ms. Olga Reel. So we very much appreciate that she took the time to introduce us to what is happening in Kazakhstan. And truly, it's fascinating to have that firsthand experience and understanding of how these rehabilitation efforts are undertaken. And especially with the historical context provided by Dr. Mallet and the guidelines provided by Mr. Geit, we can kind of see how they are applied in a specific context and how that can help us understand the more important things going forward. We will now move on to our question and answer session. As we said before, these questions were asked from our participants in the Zoom chat. Our first question is for Ms. Olga Reel. Now, Ms. Olga Reel, we know that ISIS indoctrinated children from their early age. Are there children, especially boys, who are staying radicalized, believing that the caliphate is the best option to live in and that non-Muslims remain enemies? If there are cases, how are you working with them? So I will let Cholpan take the floor to translate the question.
Ольга Владимировна, вам такой вопрос от участников. Первый вопрос такой. Мы знаем, что ИГИЛ тренировал детей из раннего возраста. Те, которые вернулись из Сирии, особенно мальчики, у вас есть те, которые очень радикализованы и с тех пор не хотят выйти этой идеологии и верят, что только калифат для них идеальное место, чтобы жить, и те, которые не мусульмане, они враги. И как вы с ними работаете? Спасибо.
Добрый вечер, спасибо большое за приглашение, участие в такой очень значимой конференции по такой теме, которая сейчас очень актуальна в Центральной, не только в Центральной Азии, ну и, наверное, во всем мире. Я хочу сказать, что да, у нас были дети, которые в своих рассказах говорили о том, что их забирали для прохождения обучения, но, к сожалению, к радости этих детей, период их обучения в таких вот специальных школах калифата был очень кратковременный.
Давайте переведем. Thank you for inviting me to such an important event. And it's true that ISIS trained children from the early age, and many children who returned, they were trained in such camps for children, and but most of them they spent very short time there. Продолжайте, пожалуйста.
Когда первые дети поступили в адаптационный центр Пактау, работая с педагогами и с психологами, дети говорили о том, что мы кафиры, даже нашим преподавателям казахской национальности, которые являются мусульманами, что мы не такие, как они, что почему мы не носим хиджабы, почему мы ходим с непокрытыми головами, почему мы не проповедуем ту религию, которую проповедовали они, когда находились там в зоне террористической активности, и ту религию, с которой они вместе с семьей вернулись в Казахстан.
Перевод. So children when arrived, when they were repatriated, so they were placed into rehabilitation center, and the work of psychologists and social workers started. And during the first days, children were repeating that they are Muslims and other non-Muslims are kafirs. And even those social workers who are not covered, for example, their heads or faces, they were like saying that if they are kafirs because they are not wearing hijab.
Но проработав месяц в адаптационном центре с этими детьми, у детей они стали понимать, что мусульманином можно быть и не обязательно носить хиджаб, и это светская религия. Что в Казахстане немножко другой подход к религиозной вещам. То есть мы старались с точки зрения психологии в игровой форме все это детям объяснить. И, конечно же, мы работали с мамами.
So after one month's work, after the hard work of social workers and psychologists, children started to understand that not all Muslims can wear hijabs. So in Kyrgyzstan, the politics and situation is different, approach to the religion is different, and people can be Muslims, but at the same time, the clothes can be free, you know. So children started to understand this difference.
И я хочу сказать, что когда дети уезжали, то они уже говорили, когда мы, смеясь, задавали вопросы. Вот у меня лично было 2 детей, которые мне конкретно говорили, что я кафирка. Когда они уезжали уже в наши реабилитационные центры на прохождение промежуточного решения вопроса, где они будут жить, они уже говорили, что я не кафирка, что они относятся к нам хорошо, что они нас любят и с радостью нас уже встречали, когда мы приезжали к ним в центры.
So I had 2 concrete examples when 2 boys, for example, they told me that I am kafir. So after working them and after spending time in rehabilitation center, these boys, when they were leaving the rehabilitation center, so they changed their minds already, and they were not telling me that I am kafir.
Я хочу сказать, что, вы знаете, нам, наверное, очень повезло, потому что мы очень так массированно начали работу с детьми, вернувшимися из зон террористической активности. Не только наш центр, но и педагоги школ, куда дети пошли. И я хочу сказать, что вот из той категории детей, которые к нам вернулись, все-таки, наверное, 80% это дети маленького возраста, которые не были вовлечены вот в обучение в этих школах халифата.
Yeah. We were lucky because 80% of repatriated children, they were very small. So they didn't were trained or had no time for indoctrination. They were very small. So that's why the process of rehabilitation and reintegration of children was quite easier for us.
Потом среди оставшихся процентов большая часть была девочки, которые вообще не привлекались. И только один молодой человек, несовершеннолетний, который был сразу же по прибытию в Казахстан, был арестован вместе со своей матерью, потому что было доказано, что он имеет отношение к совершению преступлений, связанных с терроризмом.
Majority of, yeah, and one point also, majority of returned children were girls. So as we know, girls were not involved in trainings and indoctrinations. They stayed home with their mothers. And we had one case when boy was arrested immediately after the repatriation because Kazakh authorities had clear evidences that he was involved in terrorist attacks.
Но вместе с тем я хочу сказать, что мы сталкивались с бурной фантазией детей, которые придумывали себе те действия, которые они не совершали. У нас был такой прецедент, когда детей поместили в школу, и один из старших детей, больше 12 лет, он был помещен в 1 класс, потому что он не учился никогда. Он начал завоевывать себе авторитет, рассказывая, что он стрелял, что он там в руках держал оружие и так далее.
Yeah. We had cases when boys, they tend to attract attention of classmates. They just given their fantasy as a true. And for example, we had one case when boy, he went to school and started telling stories which didn't happen, didn't occur, saying that, for example, he was shooting, he was committing something, you know, in Syria, but all of them were not true.
Мы проанализировали эту ситуацию с ребенком, поработал психолог, поработали с женами его отца, потому что у него было несколько жен, и дети, которые все росли в одном месте.
So we started working on this case, and we also had conversations with the wives of his father, because his father had several wives. So we worked on this case.
И они нам дали информацию о том, что ребенок, там, где они проживали в тот момент, там не было боевых действий, да, был обстрел, но оружие и выходить куда-то на границу стрелять этот ребенок не мог. И мы перепроверили, конечно, эти данные. Что сделали мы в последующем? Мы стали работать с ребенком, его занятия перешли в индивидуальную форму обучения, то есть он не учился в общем классе, а перевели на индивидуальное обучение в связи с тем, что ему надо было догнать хотя бы учебную программу, и чтобы как можно быстрее дать ему возможность становиться в начальной школе.
Yeah, after checking all the information and after having conversation with the close circle of this boy, it was clear that he was just, everything was his fantasy, and just to attract the attention of classmates, he was telling the stories. And finally, we decided that he shouldn't go to school at that moment, and he was taking individual classes because he was 11 years old and he was attending first grade. So we gave him time to catch up everything.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Reel. That was fascinating. I mean, that's a very frontline experience, something that we don't get to hear often. So we appreciate your presence and the very specific stories that you have been able to give us. We've had some questions here for Mr. Geit, and notably they refer to the elephant not in the room, I guess, which is COVID-19, which has affected basically every single aspect of our lives, and how Hidaya's operations may have been operated by the pandemic. You notably mentioned, working directly with families, whether we should integrate violent extremist prisoners, whether we should have sports or cultural events for them. How are these operations hampered by COVID-19, and are there any guidelines or recommendations to work with the pandemic?
Thank you. Yes, obviously that's a very timely question. And so us at Hidaya, we have been able to continue our operations. And actually we developed a model during this period, which we call the LIVE model, LIVE, which is localization, inclusivity, virtualization, and evaluation. So how to adapt your work as somebody like me who's doing capacity building programs, or for a practitioner who is directly working with individuals. And so it's really shifting the focus away from the external partners and utilizing those on the ground local actors, obviously bringing in a much more inclusive group of people than perhaps may have been originally envisioned. Virtualization, obviously things like we're doing today over the Zoom, and actually shifting the way we sometimes do evaluation as well, and looking at how we can actually evaluate our own work in relation to the impacts of COVID. And so our work, we have continued in the same way as you're doing today, as in conducting a lot of trainings virtually. And we found them to be quite successful. We are able to train practitioners in Indonesia, in Tunisia, in Nigeria, despite possible internet connection challenges. But obviously, we're not talking just about the external partners and the international organizations here. We're talking about those kind of centers and how they've been impacted. And some of the centers that have probably been impacted more are those who are providing social rehabilitation on a more voluntary basis and not on a mandated stay. So in some of these cases, there have been individuals who are affected by violent extremism who have not been charged with any crimes, but still need some sort of rehabilitation support. And yet, because of COVID-19, they are obviously being then dispersed and outside of the center. And that's caused a lot of challenges in terms of the practitioners keeping up their activities. And actually, some of the practitioners have been very good in some countries. In Indonesia, they have been very good in terms of coordinating with local community-based social workers who are then taking on some of the role that the other ones have. But some have also faced the challenge that now that they have gone virtual, that they are now 24/7 actually accessible by some of these people that they are supposed to be providing support to. And that has actually increased a lot of stress and a lot of burnout on actually the practitioners themselves. So there's been these unintended consequences of shifting the process as well. And obviously, like you say, a lot of the social and cultural events have changed as well. But I think over the year, it may have been slow at the start, but we've all kind of shifted again in terms of how we're able to do some of these things online. We're still able to hold dialogues and platforms for community members, and also engage in terms of counselling via a virtual means as well. I'm conscious of time, so I will leave it there. But if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Geit. Yes, that's very interesting, and it's a transition we've all had to make, and so especially in this domain, it is very difficult, I can imagine. So we've got a few questions for Dr. David Mallet. We'll have to choose one, and the first one that we received was about the United States. Notably, I assume, Dr. Mallet, that you would have an American perspective. And so the United States initially, as we talked about, played a very positive role in convincing states to repatriate their fighters and citizens. Washington also provided logistics, they provided support in these operations. What has changed after Joe Biden has come to power? And do you think the US will continue advocating for repatriation? And will the US actually repatriate their own fighters and look beyond the excuses?
Yep, thank you, Cooper. I mean, it's been a long time since I've actually worked in the American government. I'm actually happy on the research side, but I've had the chance to do a little bit of consulting, particularly with implementation for the Security Council resolutions with the State Department, Justice Department. So there has been a big push, but what I was trying to allude to, I think, in my presentation is that it's a bit of a not in my backyard attitude that comes about with returnees. A lot of countries will say that every other country should meet their international responsibilities, but find a reason not to take back their own citizens. There are still Americans who are detained in the camps. They have not been a high priority issue, I think mostly just because there is no national policy in the United States, unlike other countries. We've had a relatively low number, a couple of hundred individuals from the United States who ever went to begin with. So there is no single national program. And most of the people who've been prosecuted were prosecuted just on the generic charge of providing material support to terrorist organizations rather than anything specific to being a foreign fighter or a foreign terrorist fighter. So the Biden administration, I haven't seen any attempts made to expedite returns. The Trump administration was very vocal that European countries should take back their citizens, but then there were certain Americans who they would find reasons not to bring back because, let's say, the father was a diplomat or something like that. I wouldn't look for drastic changes. I would look for a more multilateral approach in general, but I haven't heard of any major new proposals being made to reduce the numbers of people being detained significantly.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Mallet. It's really unfortunate because that's all the time that we have, but we'll make sure to provide the contact details of our experts. And if ever you want to reach out to them individually and ask them questions, we will, of course, with their permission, provide you with the necessary details. So unfortunately, our panel discussion has to end. I would like to thank Mr. Geit, Dr. Mallet, and Ms. Reel for participating and for their professional insights and perspectives. Your presentations were fascinating and really helped provide an insight into understanding this very complicated issue. Thank you as well to your participants for taking the time to join us today and for engaging with our experts. We will be hosting more of these dialogues in the future, so stay tuned to the Bulan Institute. If you like this dialogue, please inform your friends and partners, and don't hesitate to reach out to us. In the meantime, I wish you all a wonderful day, wherever you may be, and we look forward to hosting events with you in the future.